It started with a moment that didn't feel like the beginning of a disaster, just a short clip, a stage, a smiling audience. And my daughter standing under bright lights, holding a microphone like she owned the world. Her voice was calm, confident, almost playful. "I think some people just fail in life and never admit it." A small laugh from the audience followed. She paused for half a second, smiled, and then said the line that changed everything. "Even my own father is a perfect example." For a moment there was silence, not shock, not outrage, just a brief pause where people weren't sure how seriously to take it. Then the audience laughed again, not because it was kind, but because it felt like part of the show, like a joke, like entertainment, and that was it. The clip ended there, short, clean. Perfectly clipped for the internet, and dangerously misunderstood. Within minutes it started spreading. First small pages reposted it, then reaction accounts picked it up. Then bigger media pages joined in, and suddenly it wasn't just a clip anymore, it became a headline. "Daughter calls father a failure on live TV." No context, no backstory, no explanation. Just a sentence designed to travel fast, and it did. At first, people reacted like they always do. Some laughed, some criticized her, some defended her. But most people did something else entirely. They watched it again, and again, and again, because something about it didn't sit right. Not because of what she said, but because of how easily she said it. Like it wasn't emotional, like it wasn't personal, like the word father didn't carry any weight anymore. Like I was just a character in a story she had already finished writing. My phone started ringing, once, then again, then non-stop, unknown numbers, relatives, old contacts. Even people I hadn't spoken to in years. But I didn't answer. Not because I was strong, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what to say. What do you say when your own child turns your name into a public discussion? There is no prepared answer for that. So I stayed silent. By the evening, I was no longer just a person. I had become a label, a failure father, a disappointment, a background story for a viral clip. People online were building a version of me I didn't recognize. They didn't know what I had done in my life. They didn't know what I had built. They didn't know what I had sacrificed, but none of that mattered anymore. Because truth doesn't travel as fast as headlines, and headlines had already decided who I was, but somewhere else, my daughter was still smiling, still doing interviews, still repeating the same energy that started it all. To her, it was just a moment, a viral clip, a funny line that landed well. She didn't feel the silence it created behind it. She didn't see the damage forming outside the frame, because she never stopped to ask one question: what happens when the person you joked about was never what you thought they were? And that night, I finally stood up from my chair, not because I had a plan, not because I had a reaction, but because I understood something very clearly. This wasn't just a viral moment anymore. This was the beginning of something that couldn't be taken back. And somewhere out there, my daughter had no idea that the story she thought was a joke was about to turn into something she could no longer control. The next morning didn't feel normal. Not because something new had happened, but because something old had changed its meaning overnight. The clip was still everywhere, but now people weren't just reacting to it. They were investigating it, and that's when everything shifted. At first, it was simple curiosity, people replaying the video, zooming in on details, rewatching her expressions. Then the questions started appearing in comments. Who is her father? Why did she say it like that? Is there more to this story? And once those questions started, they didn't stop. My name, which had been unknown to most people online, suddenly became a search term. But what they found was incomplete. Old traces, small mentions, unconnected fragments. Enough to confuse people, but not enough to explain anything. And confusion is dangerous, because when people don't have facts, they create stories. By afternoon, the narrative had already started changing. It was no longer just, a daughter humiliates her father. Now it was becoming, something is missing in this story. That's how public opinion evolves, slowly, quietly, until suddenly it's no longer the same story anymore. Meanwhile, my daughter was still in the spotlight. Interviews continued. Clips circulated of her laughing about the moment, still confident, still unaware of the direction things were moving. To her, it was still just media attention. Nothing deeper, nothing dangerous, but she didn't realize something important. The internet never leaves a story unfinished. It fills in the gaps whether they are true or not. That same day, my phone rang again. This time I answered, The voice on the other side was careful, professional, measured, a journalist. "Sir, people are asking about your background. Would you like to clarify anything?" I stayed quiet for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew whatever I said would no longer stay private. I simply replied, "No." A pause. "Then the story will continue without your side." And I said nothing after that. Because I already understood something important. Once a story leaves your control, silence becomes part of the narrative too. By night, the internet had done what it always does. It began building theories, some exaggerated, some emotional, some completely wrong. But all of them shared one thing in common: they were trying to explain me, a man they had never met. A life they had never seen, a story they had only just discovered. And somewhere inside that chaos, my daughter started noticing something was wrong, not all at once, not clearly, just small signals. The tone of messages changing, the comments no longer fully supporting her, the questions becoming sharper, the attention turning. And for the first time since the interview, her confidence began to crack slightly, not enough to break, but enough to feel. Because when the internet starts asking questions, it doesn't stop at the surface, it digs. And what it was about to find next was something no one had expected. It didn't happen loudly. There was no announcement, no dramatic reveal, just small details slowly rising to the surface. The kind of details that don't look important at first until they start connecting. The first clue came from an old article, a forgotten mention of a business deal years ago. My name appeared in it once, not as a headline, not as a celebrity, but as someone quietly involved behind the scenes. People didn't understand it at first, but they saved it. And then they looked for more, then another detail surfaced, a scholarship record, a donation program, a foundation linked to my name. At first, it didn't mean much to the internet, but then someone connected it to my daughter's education. And that's when the narrative shifted again, not fully, but enough. Because now the question wasn't just, "Who is this man?" It became, "What did he actually do for her?" Meanwhile, my daughter was beginning to feel the change in real time. Not publicly yet. Privately, in messages, in calls, in the tone of people around her. The same people who laughed with her during the interview were now asking different questions, quieter questions. Uncomfortable questions, the kind that make confidence unstable. She tried to ignore it at first, tried to treat it like normal online noise, but silence was no longer protecting her. It was isolating her, because the more she avoided answers, the louder the questions became. That evening, she finally saw something that made her stop, a post that wasn't emotional, not hateful. Just factual, a breakdown of small public records connected to my name. Nothing exaggerated, nothing dramatic, just pieces. And when those pieces came together, they didn't form the image she expected. For the first time, there was hesitation in her reactions, not regret, not understanding, just uncertainty. Because the version of me she had spoken about publicly was starting to look incomplete. And incomplete stories are dangerous, because they don't stay incomplete for long. That night I sat alone again. No calls, no messages, just silence. But this silence was different from before, because now I knew something she didn't. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was becoming a collision, one that couldn't be avoided forever. And somewhere far away, my daughter was still trying to hold on to control, not realizing that control was already slipping. Because once the truth starts moving, it doesn't stop for anyone, not even the person who started the story. The call came earlier than expected, not from my daughter, from the world around her. From people who suddenly wanted answers but didn't know how to ask them directly. Reporters again, producers, event organizers. All circling the same question now: who are you really? But I still didn't answer, because some truths don't belong to fast conversations. They belong to moments that are already unavoidable. Meanwhile, my daughter's world was changing faster than she could control. At first, it was subtle. A slight shift in interviews, a changed tone from hosts, a pause where there used to be laughter. Then came the uncomfortable silence in comment sections. Not hate, not support, just questions. And questions are more dangerous than criticism because they don't leave, they grow. Then something happened that changed everything again. An invitation, a leadership event, a major stage, the kind where important people gather, the kind where reputations are shaped in real time. And my name was on the list of keynote speakers. When I saw it, I didn't react, not because it wasn't important, but because I understood what it meant. This was no longer about the internet. It was no longer about a clip. This was now moving into real life, into rooms, into stages, into places where truth cannot hide behind screens. And then I saw something else. Her name, my daughter. Invited too, as a host for the same event, the same stage, the same audience, but neither of us knew how close the collision was going to be. For the first time in a long time, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not revenge, something quieter, heavier. The feeling that a moment you never planned for has already been decided without you. That night I didn't sleep, not because I was worried, but because I kept thinking about one simple truth. She still believed she understood me, and I still hadn't told her anything. But now there was no more space left for silence. Because silence had already done enough damage, and what was coming next could no longer be stopped. The day of the event didn't feel like a normal day. Even the air felt different, heavier. Like something was already waiting to happen. The venue was large, bright, and full of movement, cameras being adjusted, lights tested. People walking with purpose, pretending everything was under control. But nothing was under control anymore, not really. Because some moments don't wait for organization, they wait for people. I arrived earlier than most, not to prepare a speech, but to understand the space I was about to stand in. The stage was already set, my name on banners, my position marked on schedules. Everything carefully arranged like a story already written, a story the audience didn't know they were about to witness. Then I saw her, my daughter, on the other side of the corridor. Not on stage yet, not performing yet, just standing. For a moment she didn't move. Neither did I. It wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, the kind of silence that carries years inside it. She finally spoke first. "I didn't know you'd be here this early." Her voice was controlled, professional, but not fully steady. I replied calmly, "I usually arrive before noise begins." A small pause, she nodded, but didn't smile, because something about this moment felt different to her too. There was tension now, not loud, not visible, but present between every word, between every breath, because now we weren't in private life anymore. We were inside something public, something irreversible. Then she said something that stayed in the air longer than expected. "People are talking about you." I looked at her, not surprised, just aware. "And what are they saying?" I asked. She hesitated. "That I didn't know who you were." A pause, then she added quietly, "And that maybe I misunderstood everything." For the first time, there was no confidence in her voice, only uncertainty. The kind that arrives when a belief you've held for years starts to shake. Not break yet, just shake. Before I could answer, the stage coordinator called her name. Her segment was starting. She turned slightly, then stopped again, like she wanted to say something else but couldn't find the words. Finally, she asked, "Are you going to say something about all of this?" I looked at her for a long moment, then answered, "I don't need to." She frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" I stepped closer to the stage entrance and said quietly, "Truth doesn't need permission to appear." She didn't respond, but I could feel it. Something inside her had already started shifting, not fully understanding yet, but no longer fully certain either. The lights dimmed slightly. The audience began to settle. The microphone checked. The event was about to begin, and somewhere in that building, two versions of the same story were about to enter the same space. One built on perception, one built on silence. And silence was about to stop being enough. Clapperboard to be continued. The moment my name was announced, everything changed again, not gradually, instantly. It's strange how a single name can shift the energy of an entire room. One second it was noise, casual conversations, scattered applause, and the next second, silence, not empty silence. Focused silence, the kind where people stop breathing properly because they feel something important is about to happen. I stepped onto the stage, bright lights, cameras turning. Faces I couldn't clearly see, but I could feel. All of them waiting, not for a speech, but for a story, and I understood that clearly now. This was no longer just an event. It was a moment the audience had been unknowingly prepared for. I looked forward, not searching for approval, not searching for reaction, just presence. And then I saw her, my daughter, standing off to the side of the stage, watching still. And for the first time, she wasn't smiling, not even slightly. I began speaking, not loudly, not dramatically, calmly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." A small reaction moved through the audience. People leaned in. phones lifted slightly. The room became sharper, more attentive. I continued. For a long time, people have been reacting to a version of me that was never complete. A pause. And when a story is incomplete, people fill the gaps with what feels believable. I glanced briefly toward her. She didn't move, but I could feel her listening differently now, not as a host. Not as a public figure, but as a daughter hearing something she had never heard before. The room stayed silent. Even the host didn't interrupt, because something had shifted. This was no longer entertainment. It was realization beginning to form. I continued. I never spoke much about my life, not because I had nothing to say, but because I never felt the need to turn it into a performance. A pause. But silence has a cost. Another pause. And sometimes that cost is misunderstanding. That word hit differently. Misunderstanding. Not accusation, not blame, just truth. And truth, when spoken calmly, is often heavier than emotion. Then I said it, the line that changed everything. My daughter didn't insult me because she hated me. A pause. She did it because she never truly knew who she was speaking about. The reaction was immediate, not loud, but deep, a shift in the room. Like everyone suddenly realized they had been watching only one side of a story. Behind me, I heard movement. My daughter stepped slightly forward, not fully, just enough for me to notice. Her voice came out quieter than before. I didn't know. 2 words, simple, but no longer confident, no longer sharp, just human. The audience didn't react this time. Because there was nothing to react to, only realization. I turned slightly toward her, not with anger, not with victory, just understanding. And I said calmly, not knowing is not the same as not caring. A pause. But it still changes everything. Silence again. But this silence was different, not tension, not suspense. This was the silence that comes after truth is finally spoken out loud. The host tried to step in gently, but even he seemed unsure now, because the story had already moved beyond control. I looked at the audience one last time, and added softly, this was never about success or failure. It was about distance, and what happens when distance becomes too normal for too long. A long pause, no applause, no interruption. Just stillness. And in that stillness, something inside my daughter finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The way truth usually breaks things, without permission. She didn't leave. She didn't speak again, she just stood there, hearing everything for the first time without assumptions in between. And I realized something in that moment. This was not revenge. It was not humiliation. It was not victory. It was something far more irreversible. Understanding. And once understanding arrives, nothing can stay exactly the same again. The silence didn't break immediately. Even after I stopped speaking, nobody moved. No applause, no reaction, just silence hanging in the air like something unfinished. Because the audience had heard something they weren't prepared for, not drama, not entertainment, but reality. Behind the stage lights, I could feel her presence, my daughter, still standing there. Still processing, not speaking, not reacting. Just listening in a way she had never listened before, not as a performer, not as a host, but as someone who was suddenly unsure of everything she thought she knew. The host finally tried to recover the moment. He smiled slightly, but it didn't feel natural anymore. Daniel, that's very powerful. He paused, searching for direction, but there was none anymore because the moment had already moved beyond structure. I nodded once, not to him, but to the situation. Because I understood something clearly now, this wasn't a speech anymore. This was a shift. Then I stepped back slightly from the microphone, not because I was finished, but because there was nothing more to add. Truth had already spoken everything that needed to be said. And that's when I saw her move, slowly. My daughter stepped forward from the side of the stage. Not confidently, not publicly, just carefully, like every step was heavier than the last. She stopped a few feet away from me, close enough to speak, but not close enough to pretend nothing had changed. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then finally, I didn't understand. Her voice was low, not defensive, not sharp, just fragile. I looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just quiet awareness. Because this wasn't the first time she had spoken, but it was the first time she had meant it differently. Before I could respond, the stage coordinator quietly signaled from the side. The segment was technically over, but no one moved, because nobody wanted to interrupt what was happening. And in that moment, I realized something important. The story was no longer about what happened on TV. It was about everything that was never said after it. And that silence between us was finally starting to speak. Her words still stayed in the air. I didn't understand, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to change the feeling of everything around us. Because regret doesn't need volume, it only needs honesty. For the first time since this began, the stage didn't feel like a stage anymore. No audience, no cameras, no performance. Just two people standing in a space where everything had already been said, but not everything had been understood. My daughter looked down for a moment, not because she was hiding, but because she was searching for words she had never needed before. Then she spoke again. I thought I knew enough to say what I said. A pause. But I didn't know what I didn't know. The honesty in her voice changed something, not the past, not the moment, but the direction of it. Because truth spoken too late doesn't fix what happened, but it changes what comes next. I didn't interrupt her, because for once she wasn't performing, she was reflecting. And reflection is something that only happens when certainty disappears. She continued quietly. When people asked me about you, I answered too fast. A pause. Because I thought I already understood everything. Her voice tightened slightly. But I didn't ask you. That line stayed longer than the others because it wasn't about blame. It was about distance. I finally spoke, calmly. You didn't fail by not knowing. A pause. You failed by never asking. Not harsh, not emotional, just truth. She nodded slowly, not arguing. Not defending, just accepting something she had avoided for a long time. The audience was still silent, even though they were there, even though they were watching. It felt like they understood they were no longer part of this moment. They were only witnesses. My daughter finally looked up at me again. This time her voice was different, quieter, smaller. What happens now? That question changed everything again, because now we were no longer talking about the past. We were talking about what comes after truth. I looked at her for a long moment. Not searching for revenge, not searching for justice, just understanding the weight of that question. Then I said, now we stop reacting. A pause. And start understanding. Something in her expression shifted. Not relief, not closure, but awareness, because understanding takes time and cannot be rushed. The stage lights slowly dimmed slightly. Not intentionally, but as if even the environment understood the moment was no longer about performance. And in that fading light, I realized something simple. This wasn't the end of a confrontation. It was the beginning of a conversation that should have happened years ago. The event didn't end with a loud reaction. It ended the way real moments often do, slowly, quietly, almost uncertainly. People started to move again, cameras adjusted, lights softened, voices returned in fragments. But the center of everything was no longer the stage. It was the silence we had just lived through. My daughter stayed where she was, still, not frozen but thoughtful. Like her mind was replaying everything she had ever said, and trying to find where it started to drift away from truth. I stepped slightly away from the microphone, not because I had more to say, but because everything important had already been said. Now words would only reduce it. She finally spoke again, not to the audience, not to the cameras, only to me. I built a version of you in my mind, a pause, and I never checked if it was real. That sentence didn't hurt, it didn't shock, it just settled deep. Because it explained everything without blaming anything, I nodded slowly. That's what people do when they don't ask, a pause, they imagine instead. She took a breath, long, unsteady. Then asked quietly, did you ever try to tell me? That question stayed in the air longer than anything else, because the answer wasn't simple, not yes, not no, something in between. I answered honestly. I tried in the only way I knew, a pause, by living it, not explaining it. She looked down again, not in shame, but in realization, because she understood something now. That silence can protect, but it can also distance. The room around us slowly became irrelevant. The event was still happening, but not for us. We were somewhere else now, mentally, emotionally. Somewhere far quieter, she finally said, I don't want this to end like this. Her voice was softer now, less certain, more human. I looked at her. And for the first time, I didn't see the moment that started this story. I saw everything before it. The years, the distance, the unspoken assumptions. Then I said something simple. It doesn't end here. A pause. It just stops being misunderstood here. That line changed the energy again, not dramatically, but gently, like something heavy had finally been placed down. The stage lights dimmed further. People around us began to give space. Not because they were told, but because they felt they should, and in that space there was no more audience. No more performance, just two people finally standing in the truth without interruption. The building was quieter now, not empty but changed. Like everything inside, it had finally accepted that something important had already finished happening, even if the event itself was still technically ongoing. People were still moving in the background, still talking, still reacting in small pieces, but none of it reached us anymore. My daughter stood beside me, no longer on the opposite side of the moment. Just beside, not as a host, not as a public figure, just as someone trying to understand something she had never been taught how to face. Silence. She finally spoke, almost in a whisper. "I don't know how to fix what I said." A pause. "And I don't know how to go back to before it." I looked at her for a long time, not as someone trying to win, not as someone trying to correct, but as someone who had lived long enough to understand something simple. Not everything broken needs to be fixed immediately. Some things need time first. I said calmly, "You don't go back." A pause. "You move forward with awareness." She nodded slowly. For the first time, there was no resistance in her expression. Only acceptance of something she could not undo. We walked away from the stage together, not rushed, not dramatic, just leaving. Like the story had stopped performing and started becoming real life again. Outside, the air felt different, colder, quieter, less like an audience existed anywhere nearby. She finally asked, "Will people always remember it like that?" I thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "People remember what they see first." A pause. "But life is not what people see first." She didn't respond, because she understood what that meant now. There was no final apology, no dramatic closure, no perfect resolution. Because real life doesn't wrap itself neatly like a story, it continues, and before she left she said something small, almost unsure. "Can we still talk?" I nodded. "Yes." A pause. "Just differently now?" She looked at me for a moment longer, then slowly walked away, not as a daughter who had fixed everything, but as someone who had finally started to see everything differently. And I stayed there for a while, not because there was anything left to do, but because silence feels different after truth. It doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels honest. People think stories end when the truth comes out. But that's not true. Truth is never the end. It's just the moment everything stops being an illusion. And what comes after is not victory, not revenge, not even forgiveness. It's awareness, quiet, uncomfortable, real. Because once you see someone clearly, you can never fully go back to the version of them you imagined before. And maybe that's the real ending of every story. Not when everything is solved, but when nothing can be misunderstood the same way again. And in that silence, there are no winners, no losers. Just people finally seeing each other without the noise in between.